All right, what is up, Utes fans? This is Joseph back with the Utah Utes Football Digest. And I know a lot of you guys probably noticed I haven't made a video for a couple weeks. Honestly, I was just kind of using that as a little bit of an off season. You'd be surprised how much work and time really goes into all this. So I'm back. Good to be here. And I thought a fun first exercise, considering over these past few weeks and really past few months, it's all been about Pac 12, Big 12, mergers, expansion, this or that. And so I think a really fun topic that we could discuss today is how would Utah do in the Pac 12? So if we take Utah and look at strength of schedule, look at rankings, look at yards, look at points, look at defense. How would Utah do? Where would Utah be in the Big 12 if they were to go there? Let's go ahead and dive in. Okay, and here we go. The first thing we're going to look at is going to be total yards. So you take a look here at the screen. You can see how Utah would compare against the Big 12 schools. Now, just so everybody knows, at the end of this, we're going to look at all these numbers. Then we're going to look at strength of schedule, factor that in to get a really analytical evaluation of how Utah would have done in the Big 12. So you look here, Utah had the 20th total yard offense in the country at 457 yards per game. The only teams in the Big Ten that were super close to Utah were Houston and UCF. UCF beating them out by a little, and Texas Tech, TCU were close to. But the only teams that actually beat or really got close to Utah were two teams that weren't actually in the Big 12 and haven't been yet. So off these last year numbers, Utah would basically be right up there as the best offense in the Big 12, excluding UCF, who's not yet a member. Okay, and the next thing we're going to be looking at is going to be points per game. So we looked at how many yards the offenses are getting, but how good are they at actually capitalizing and scoring on the yards they're getting. So take a look here. We've got TCU at the top. You know, they were quite the Cinderella story last year, running through the regular season, one of the best teams in college football. You know, they get to the college football playoff, they beat Michigan, and then they lose in the national championship, but an amazing team. And then we got Houston, number 13 in the country at 36 points per game, high powered offense, basically tied with Utah. Just you guys will see some where the numbers are different in their rankings, but the number on the right is the same. I'm just rounding up or rounding down with those numbers to make it easier to read. So Utah is 14th, right next to Houston, basically the exact same offense, points per game. Uh, we'll look at strength of schedule in a little while, but understand that Utah is playing a significantly harder schedule than Houston is. Kansas, a surprisingly high-powered offense. I remember they had a run last year, but still, I was a little surprised to see just how high they were on total yards and points per game. Kansas State, good offense. So, you go down this list. None of these, there's not a lot of bad offenses outside of Iowa State, which really looked rough. Like Iowa State looked bad, but outside of that, not a lot of bad offenses. So that is we just went over the yards per game for each team and points per game for each team. And before we move into the defenses for all the teams in the Big 12 in Utah, please do make sure you guys like the video. Also, comment down below. I'd love to hear what you guys are thinking. Are you surprised by any of the numbers so far? How do you think Utah would do in the Big 12? And make sure you guys subscribe to the channel whether you're a Utah fan, a Pac 12 fan, or a Big 12 fan. Who knows how much we'll all be together over these next couple of years. So make sure you guys subscribe. And now let's move on to the defenses. All right, now let's look at the defenses. We'll look at both of these at the same time opponents' points per game and opponents' yards per game. So, opponents' points per game, how many points is your team letting up on average each game? Yards per game, how many yards is your defense letting up each game? You know what is wild as I go through these numbers? I don't know if it's a Big 12 thing. It feels like a Big 12 thing a little bit, not across the board, but there are some very uneven teams. The first one I'm going to point out is Iowa State, just straight garbage offense, but one of the best defenses in the freaking country. 18th in points per game allowed and second in yards per game allowed. It's pretty crazy. I'm sure having a terrible offense makes it easy for other teams not to get a ton of yards against you, but still, just a observation. Must have been a heck of a defense there. All right, Cincinnati, good in both of these categories: opponent points per game and opponent yards per game. Utah, pretty solid in both as well, 35th in opponent points per game and 29th in opponent yards per game, they're 35th, and opponent points per game, 29th. So you look at it here. So one thing I noticed with the Big 12 though is definitely you would desire more defense. I mean, look at this. You look at these teams here. We have one, two, three, four, five, six teams that are 89 or lower. Five of those teams are 97 or lower, and three of those teams are at 108 or lower. So some pretty tough defense. I mean, not tough. Like it's weird. It's like some of these teams in the Big 12, it's like they're either very good at defense or just straight terrible. And a lot of these teams that have actual respectable defensive numbers weren't in the Big 12 last year. Anyways, though, so that's the defenses for all of them. Very exciting. Next, we're going to break down the big list, look at everything. So it should be a lot of fun. We'll see how Utah would actually do in comparison when we look at all the numbers. Okay, guys, and now we're going to look at all the data we just talked about together and see how each team scored. And so, what I did here is I broke up each category into different columns. So, you look here, like strength of schedule has a score 1 to 5, yards per game for your offense has a score 1 to 4. And the only one that goes 1 to 5 is strength of schedule. And I set it up this way to make it so you can't win purely on strength of schedule. But if you had a significantly harder schedule than the other teams, I want that to benefit you a little bit at least. And if you had a significantly worse schedule than the other teams, that has to hurt you a little. I mean, we do have to play that into account. And before I go through this, Utah does score pretty well in this. I'm not going to lie. I have not added up the numbers. I do not know who the winner is. So let's go through it. So first, we're looking at strength of schedule. There's only two teams that scored a 5, and that is TCU and that is Texas, or in TCU and Kansas State. So both of them get a 5 because they have top 10 schedules. Um, I could have given, you know what? I'm actually going to change this. Let's go ahead and say that Texas Tech gets a 4, and we'll just call if you're in the top 15. And I did numbers for this one though. It was a little tough to pick exact numbers. All these guys, Kansas, Utah, Iowa State, Baylor, West Virginia, like almost the exact same strength of schedule. So they're all getting 3s. The higher the score, the better, just so you guys all understand this. UCF through BYU all had pretty average schedules. So we gave them 2s. So it's not really hurting them, but these schools get a slight tiny bump just for having harder schedules. All right, and then we move over here to total yards. So total yards per game for the offense. You take a look here. We've got some good ones. How I did it with these is anyone that was inside the top 10 would get a 4. Anyone that was 11 through 30 gets a 3. Anyone that was 31 through 65 would get a 2. Anyone that was below 65 gets a 1. You guys can look at the numbers here. It's exactly like I just said it. So some teams scored pretty well here, some didn't. Points per game score exactly the same. All of these yards and points per game, I scored them exactly the same. 1 through 10, they get a 4. Anything outside, so like right here, TCU gets a 4 because they have really good points per game. If you're from 11 to 30, you get a 3. So basically, that's how it goes. Same with opponent points per game score. Uh, Same idea. So a lot of rough defenses in the Big 12. So a lot of ones in this one. And same with yards per game. Oh, let's center that. Sorry, I'm a bit of a spreadsheet nerd if you didn't notice. All right. Um, with that though, so it looks really good. So drum roll, please, and let's break down who the number one team is on this list. How would Utah do? Where is Utah going to rank? Let's check it out. Okay, guys, let's go ahead and dive in. Very exciting. A lot of research here. if you guys disagree with the scoring, is what it is. I tried to make it pretty fair, so I'd be surprised if too many people are upset. But and I think with there's two teams that are tied for worst place in the Big 12. So we'll see if you guys agree. Here we go, right off the bat. BYU and West Virginia are tied for last place in the Big 12. I'm sure a lot of people are going to say the scoring's biased or I'm biased because BYU's last place. Honestly, BYU, it's a 1 year sample size we're looking at. So, take it as you will. But BYU did pretty poorly last year and didn't have a tough strength of schedule. So, when you look at that, it's tough to argue with that. So that is the last place tie, BYU and West Virginia. So now let's take it to the next group. We've got Oklahoma State. Oklahoma State is third from last in the Big 12 with a score of 9. Cincinnati is fourth from last in the Big 12 with a score of 10. So these scores are getting a little better. This next group is all going to be pretty dang close. There's a lot of close. I mean, there's a lot of high-powered offenses. A lot of good teams here. Don't get me wrong. I'm not trying to bash any of these teams. We're just trying to find out where Utah would rank. So right now, it says 14th 13th place would be BYU, and then West Virginia, Oklahoma State, Cincinnati. Tied with Cincinnati is Houston. They had a very high powered offense as well, but not the greatest strength of schedule. You got to factor that in. I know a lot of Houston fans watching this might not love how much that played a role, but not looking at that and taking it as a significant factor is unfair to the teams like TCU and that played a really tough schedule. All right, next we got UCF. So we got a three-way tie there with UCF, Houston, Cincinnati. I don't really disagree with that much. I feel like those teams all felt really similar. Houston had quite a high-powered offense, but overall the teams felt really similar. Baylor as well with a tie. Wow, a lot of teams right at this 10-point spot. So a big tie. And we're getting to the middle of the conference now. So we're going to look at the top 7 teams next, or top 6 teams next. Okay, Kansas again with 10. Okay, so a lot of teams with 10, right? Okay, a lot of teams with 10. Then Texas Tech officially is in 5th place with 11 points. And remember, this is including Utah. Okay, next is Iowa State. Kind of tough. Iowa State had a really bad defense, or a really, really good defense, really bad offense. So tough to say there. Tough to say how much I love how high Iowa State is. Okay, the next is a three-way tie for the top spot. So three-way tie for the top spot. The total score, we got TCU, Kansas State, and Utah all tied for the top spot. I think the only one I really don't love is how well Iowa State did in this scoring. But either way, I don't want to get lost in that. I think outside of that, it's pretty accurate. I think this is pretty fair for how well the teams did last year. If we're looking at last year coming into this year, how would we rank them? And that's really how I look at it. I think Utah would be one of the best teams in the Big 12 and be competing for that top spot. I think that's fair. I think if you don't agree with that, I think you might be a little biased, right? Outside of that, though, let me know what you guys think. Make sure you like the video, comment down below, and if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel. We're going to be doing a lot of Utah Utes content, a lot of expansion content, conference content, is what it is. So make sure you guys hang out on the channel. It's been great. Have a good weekend, guys. I'm going to go eat some Raisin Canes.